The ground trembled before the clash even began. It wasn't an earthquake, though to the men in Alexander's ranks it may as well have been. It was the sound of 100,000 Persians shifting in place, armor rattling, weapons clinking, horses stamping hooves against the flattened earth of the plain. The rumble rolled across the battlefield like distant thunder, a steady, unnerving reminder of the storm they were about to face. The sun had barely risen, and already the air was thick with heat. A haze of dust hung over the plain of Gaugamela, stirred by thousands of restless men and beasts. It clung to throats, stung eyes, and mixed with the sour tang of sweat and oiled bronze. The Macedonians stood in perfect formation on the ridge, 40,000 strong, phalangites bristling with sarissas, cavalry poised like coiled serpents on the wings, archers and skirmishers waiting in the gaps. Each man was tense, not from disorder, but from the sheer weight of silence before the storm. They could see the Persians stretched across the horizon like a living wall, banners snapping in the wind, war cries echoing even before the first sword had been drawn. Yet amid the fear, amid the dust and uncertainty, one figure sat calm. Alexander, only 25 years old, yet already undefeated in battle. His hair, a burnished gold, caught the light like a crown of fire. His eyes, sharp and restless, fixed on the Persian king who waited across the plain. Bucephalus, the great black horse he had tamed as a boy, stamped and tossed his head beneath him, eager for the charge. Alexander leaned forward in the saddle, studying every shift, every flicker of the Persian line. To his men, he looked serene, almost detached, as though this were not war, but a problem to be solved. Behind him, the Macedonian army waited, spears raised like a forest of iron. He gave them nothing but silence. Then came the blast of the trumpet. Alexander turned, voice carrying over the dry wind. "Today," he called, "we decide who rules Asia." The Macedonians roared as one, the sound cutting through the Persian chants. It wasn't just noise, it was defiance, a small army daring the greatest empire on earth to break them. Across the plain, Darius III, King of Kings, stood tall in his royal chariot. His banners of purple and gold rippled behind him, guarded by the Immortals, Persia's legendary elite. Unlike Alexander, who rode among his men, Darius loomed above his army, a distant figure set apart from the rank and file. From his vantage, he could see the full might of Persia arrayed in dazzling formation. To his left, the cavalry of Bactria and Scythia, horsemen famed for their savagery, snarled and pulled at the reins. To his right, archers and cavalry from Armenia, Cappadocia, and Mesopotamia stretched in glittering ranks. At the front, scythed chariots glimmered like deadly fishhooks in the morning light, their blades honed to rip through flesh and bone. Behind them, hulking war elephants shifted uneasily, imported from India for this single day. Their sheer size was enough to shake the courage of any man who had never seen such beasts before. Darius believed he had prepared the perfect trap. His engineers had flattened the plain to make it smooth and open, the ideal killing field for his chariots. He had the numbers, the beasts, the terrain. He would crush Alexander here and scatter his ashes across the dust of Mesopotamia. Yet Darius could not see the calculation in Alexander's stillness. On the Macedonian ridge, the tension stretched thin as wire. The smell of sweat, leather, and iron clung to the men. They shifted their shields, spat into the dust, muttered prayers to gods of war and home. At Alexander's side stood Parmenion, his most trusted general, gray-haired and cautious. He leaned in, his voice barely audible over the restless murmurs of the army. "They outnumber us 3-1, Parmenion said, eyes narrowing at the endless Persian line. "And the field favors them. A frontal assault would be suicide." Alexander did not answer at once. His gaze was fixed on Darius, far away at the center of that human ocean. His silence stretched until even Parmenion's patience began to fray. Finally, Alexander spoke. "Then we will not attack them frontally." Parmenion frowned. "What do you mean?" Alexander's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "We will make Darius think he has trapped us, and then we will cut the heart from his army." There was no arrogance in his tone, only certainty. The trumpet blared again. Slowly, deliberately, Alexander began to shift his army. He pulled his right wing outward, sliding across the plain as if to circle the Persians. Dust rose in sheets behind them, veiling the sun, choking the breath of men. At first, the Persians thought it was a small adjustment, a shuffle of position, but as minutes stretched, it became unmistakable. Alexander was moving steadily right toward the edge of the battlefield. Outrage rippled through the Persian command. Darius, unwilling to let Alexander outflank him, ordered his left wing to shadow the movement. Cavalry and infantry shuffled, extending the line to counter. Alexander kept moving. The Macedonian line slid farther, as if drawn by some invisible hand. The Persians followed, their line stretching thinner and thinner across the plain, like a bowstring pulled too tight. The standoff could not last. A scream shattered the silence. One of the Persian chariots lurched forward, wheels screaming, horses foaming at the mouth as the driver lashed them mercilessly. The scythed blades on the wheels flashed like fangs in the sun. Then came another and another. Dozens of chariots thundered forward in unison, the ground shaking beneath their charge. The air filled with the pounding of hooves, the shriek of metal, and the roar of Persian war cries. They came on like a storm, aiming to smash through the phalanx and cut Alexander's line in two. But Alexander was ready. His hand rose. The phalanx moved as one. Ranks opened, creating sudden corridors. The chariots, expecting to crash into a wall of shields and spears, found themselves hurtling into empty lanes. And in those lanes waited death. Macedonian javelins and sarissas jabbed from both sides. Horses screamed as iron punched into their flanks. Drivers were ripped from their seats, slashed, trampled under their own beasts. Chariots overturned, their blades hacking uselessly at the air as they toppled into the dust. The plain erupted into chaos, dust clouds rising, screams tearing the sky, the smell of blood thickening the air. Yet through it all, Alexander remained calm, eyes fixed not on the chaos of the chariots, but on the Persian king at the center. The trap was not yet sprung, but the first crack in Persia's great tide had opened, and Alexander was already pulling the strings that would tear the empire apart. The chariots lay shattered on the field, twisted wrecks of wood and iron, their horses screaming as they thrashed in the dust. Blood pooled in the sand. Men dragged the injured back, while others planted their shields, spears bristling outward in case more came. But Alexander did not look at the wreckage. His eyes stayed locked on the horizon. The Persians were moving. A ripple had passed through their massive army. The scythed chariots had failed, but Darius was not finished. He barked an order, and from the Persian left came a new thunder, cavalry. Thousands of hooves pounded the earth, a tide of horsemen sweeping down in a wide arc, their armor flashing like a storm of mirrors. Arrows whistled overhead as mounted archers loosed volleys that darkened the sky. Dust rose, choking, blinding, swallowing the Macedonian right wing. At the tip of that wing rode Alexander. He did not hesitate. With Bucephalus surging beneath him, Alexander angled his companion cavalry forward, his elite, his hammer. Now, he roared, and the companions answered with a scream. They thundered into the Persian cavalry head-on. The impact was bone-splintering. Lances drove into men and horses alike. Shields buckled. Swords flashed in the blur of dust. The air filled with the sharp crack of iron meeting flesh, the shrieks of the dying, the guttural curses of men locked chest to chest. Alexander himself was in the thick of it, his lance skewering one rider clean off his horse. He ripped it free, blood spraying across his cuirass, and wheeled Bucephalus around to strike again. His men fought not as scattered riders, but as a single organism, wheeling in disciplined arcs, carving deep wounds into the Persian mass. But the Persians had numbers. For every rider that fell, another surged forward. Arrows rained like black hail. The sky itself seemed to hiss with death. The Macedonians were holding, for now. On the opposite side of the battlefield, the Persians struck again. Darius hurled his right wing, cavalry and infantry, against Parmenion, who commanded Alexander's left. The clash was instant and brutal. The Persian horse smashed into Macedonian lines, their sheer weight pushing the left backward. Shields buckled. Men cried out as spears splintered against the tide. "Hold the line," Parmenion bellowed, voice hoarse above the din. His men planted cuirasses, forming a bristling hedge of iron. Horses screamed as they impaled themselves, riders tumbling into the dust only to be cut down by short Macedonian swords. Still, the Persians pressed, endless as the sea. The Macedonian left bent, straining, buckling. And somewhere in the chaos, a gap began to open. Alexander had been waiting for it. The Persians were so intent on overwhelming both flanks that their center, where Darius sat high on his chariot, had begun to loosen. In their eagerness to stretch the line wide, the heart of the army had thinned. Alexander saw it, and he acted. He feigned retreat, pulling his cavalry further right, as if fleeing the tide of Persian horse. The Persians roared, surging after him. But in chasing him, they left a corridor, an open wound in the Persian line. Alexander's eyes lit with fire. He yanked Bucephalus around. "Forward," he thundered. "With me, to the king." The companion cavalry wheeled with him, a sudden pivot so sharp it carved the air. Their lances dropped, their voices rose in one united roar. And like a spear of iron, they drove straight into the heart of the Persian army. The dust exploded around them as they thundered forward. Persian infantry, caught off guard, scattered before the fury of the companions. Men screamed, trampled under hooves. Spears punched through shields, swords tore through flesh. And ahead, towering above the chaos, was the royal chariot, Darius. He watched in horror as Alexander cut a burning path toward him. The King of Kings had seen battles before, but never had he felt death bearing down on him so personally, so suddenly. The Macedonian wedge was an arrow aimed at his heart. Closer, closer. Alexander's eyes were fixed, unblinking, a predator's gaze. His men followed, tearing the Persian center apart in their frenzy. The clash was within moments of reaching the king himself, and then Darius faltered. Panic broke him. With Alexander closing fast, Darius seized the reins, wheeled his chariot about, and fled. At first it was only him. But panic spreads like fire. The royal guard, seeing their king retreat, began to break. Then the infantry behind them. Then the cavalry. The Persian center dissolved. What had been a wall of steel only minutes before now shuddered, cracked, and collapsed. The heart of the empire turned and ran. The dust rose higher, the cries more desperate. The King of Kings was gone from the field. On the Macedonian left, Parmenian's men did not know Darius had fled. They were still being crushed under the weight of Persian cavalry. Their line bent nearly to breaking. Messengers galloped to Alexander. "The left is collapsing. Parmenion begs for aid." Here lies the test. Alexander could chase Darius now, cut him down, end the Persian Empire in a single stroke, or he could turn back, save his own men from annihilation. His jaw tightened. He looked once more into the dust where Darius had vanished. Then he wrenched Bucephalus's reins. "Back to the left," he bellowed. The companions wheeled, thundering across the field to where their comrades fought for their lives. They arrived like thunder. Alexander smashed into the Persian cavalry, hammering Parmenian's line. The sudden impact turned the tide. Macedonian swords hacked into Persian backs. Lances drove men from their saddles. The Persians, now caught between two Macedonian forces, faltered. Panic spread. Shouts turned to screams. The Persian right, seeing their king gone, began to melt away. And then the rout began. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. Persian soldiers threw down weapons, trampling each other in their desperation to flee. Horses bolted riderless, screaming. Dust turned the air into a choking haze, lit by the glint of steel and the arcs of falling men. The Macedonians pursued, cutting down stragglers, seizing chariots and standards. The ground was slick with blood, strewn with broken shields, shattered spears, and bodies. The empire of Persia was broken in a single day. But amid the carnage, Alexander did not smile. He sat high on Bucephalus, chest heaving, eyes sweeping the carnage. His armor was smeared with blood, his own in scratches, more from others, but his gaze was cold, focused not on victory but on the horizon. Somewhere out there, Darius still lived, and that meant the hunt was not over. The Macedonians moved through the field, slowly, methodically. Soldiers stripped weapons from the dead, carried wounded comrades to makeshift tents, and slit the throats of Persian horses too mangled to rise. The air stank of iron and rot, already beginning. Flies swarmed thick over the blood-soaked earth. Men staggered, eyes vacant, unable to speak. Some vomited, doubled over beside bodies of friends and enemies alike. Even veterans trembled at the sight. Persian corpses stacked like firewood where the companion cavalry had cut through, horses tangled in their own harnesses, drivers hacked to pieces beside overturned chariots. This was not glory. It was a slaughter. And yet, the Macedonians had endured. 40,000 against 100,000, outnumbered more than 2 to 1. And they had not only survived, they had shattered the greatest army on earth. Parmenion rode up to Alexander, his face gray with exhaustion. Blood shrieked his cheek, though whether his own or another's, none could say. "It is done," he rasped. "Their right has broken, their center scattered. What remains flees east. The plain is ours." Alexander did not answer at once. His gaze lingered on the distance, where the last rays of sun bled over the horizon. "Darius?" he asked. "Gone," Parmenion said. "Fled in his chariot the moment you pressed the center. We nearly had him, but..." His voice trailed off. Alexander's jaw tightened. The muscles in his hand clenched on the reins until his knuckles whitened. "We will have him yet," he said, voice low, dangerous. Parmenion said nothing more. He knew that tone. As night fell, the Macedonians pressed their pursuit. Cavalry fanned across the plain, cutting down Persian stragglers. Camp followers were seized, supply trains looted. Torches flared in the dark, throwing monstrous shadows across the blood-stained earth. The screams did not end with the battle. Persian soldiers begged for mercy, throwing down their arms, only to be speared in the back as they ran. The Macedonians, hardened by years of campaign, showed no pity. They had seen their comrades cut down, had faced annihilation, and now vengeance burned hotter than compassion. In one corner of the field, a group of Persian nobles fought to the last, surrounded, their jeweled armor glinting even in the fading light. Alexander's men tore them apart, dragging their banners back as trophies. Elsewhere, captured Persian women wailed as they were herded with the spoils of war. The victors did not always restrain themselves. It was ugly. It was merciless. It was a war. When Alexander entered the abandoned Persian camp, he found luxury beyond imagination. Silk tents stretched like palaces, filled with golden goblets, jeweled couches, chests overflowing with coins. Perfumes lingered in the air, a sickly sweet contrast to the stench of blood. It was not the camp of an army, but of a king who had expected to celebrate his victory in decadent comfort. Darius had fled so quickly he left even his family behind. His mother, his wife, his daughters, all were taken alive by the Macedonians. When brought before Alexander, they trembled, expecting cruelty. Instead, Alexander bowed to them with courtesy, assuring them they would be treated as royalty still. He was ruthless in war, but he knew the power of image. By sparing them, he showed himself not just as a conqueror, but as a king who could command loyalty. The contrast was stark. The field outside reeked of carnage, but within the royal tents, Alexander showed restraint that stunned even his generals. In the days that followed, the full scale of the victory became clear. Persian losses numbered in the tens of thousands. Some claimed 40,000, others far more. Macedonian casualties were far lighter, though still bloody, around 4,000 men dead, many more wounded. A staggering disparity. Word spread quickly. The greatest army in the world had been broken, its king sent fleeing like a coward. Across the empire, whispers grew louder. Darius was no longer invincible. Alexander was not merely a challenger, he was destiny. But Alexander was not satisfied. Every night, he paced his tent, staring into the dark. Victory at Gaugamela had given him Asia in all but name, yet one truth gnawed at him. Darius still breathed. He remembered the look on the king's face as he turned to flee, the terror, the disbelief. Alexander had come within moments of ending the war then and there. One more push, one more heartbeat, and the King of Kings would have fallen beneath his lance. Now he would have to chase him across the empire, and Alexander would not rest until the deed was done. The significance of that day rippled far beyond the plain of Gaugamela. Persia's dominance, which had stretched from Egypt to India for 2 centuries, cracked like glass. The satraps, the governors of Persia's vast provinces, began to defect, one by one, swearing loyalty to Alexander. Babylon opened its gates to him. Susa, the royal treasury, followed. The wealth of an empire now lay in his hands. For the Greeks who had followed him from Macedon, the victory was almost beyond comprehension. They had set out as soldiers of a small kingdom on the fringes of Europe. Now they stood masters of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The course of history had bent in a single afternoon. Years later, veterans would speak of that day with haunted eyes. They would remember the wall of Persian steel, the thunder of hooves, the dust so thick it choked the breath from their lungs. They would remember the moment when the line seemed ready to snap, when death pressed so close they could smell the blood on their enemy's breath. And then they would remember Alexander, young, fearless, blazing with a fire that seemed almost divine, as he drove straight at the heart of the Persian army and broke it. They had seen kings before, but this was no mere king. This was something else. As the sun rose on the days after Gaugamela, the plain was quiet. The bodies had been buried or burned, the weapons gathered, the wounded tended. Birds circled overhead, drawn to the scent of death. Alexander rode across the field one last time. He said nothing, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had taken Persia, but he had not yet taken Darius. And so, with his army at his back and the world at his feet, he spurred Bucephalus eastward. The chase was not over. The world was his, but he would not rest until the last crown lay in his hands.